Hi, in this Let's Create series, we're creating the core game mechanic for a range of simple games. In this series, we're going to look at Breakout, the classic block breaking game. You're going to have blocks that can be destroyed by hitting them a different number of times, and then the paddle, depending on where the ball hits it, the ball will bounce off in a different direction. Let's get started. I'm starting with a new Unity 2D project called Breakout. The first thing we'll focus on is getting the scene set up ready for our game. Create a sprites folder using the right-click menu. To this, we'll add our block image, which you can find a link for in the description below. This is 100 by 30. That will be important later. It just has rounded corners and some slight gradient on it to make the game look less flat. It's white, so we can add colour to it to make the block any colour we want. We'll add two other standard sprites to the folder. Right-click, create 2D sprites square, which will be our walls, so we'll rename that wall. Doing the same again, we'll select the circle, which will be our ball. In the hierarchy, we'll right-click and add an empty game object. Call this blocks, as we'll use this to hold all our blocks. Make sure the transform is reset so it's at 0. Drag the block into this to create one in our scene. Firstly, we'll make it a bit more interesting in colour. Click on the colour in the sprite renderer, and I'm going to make this first one a soft pink. We'll also add a box collider 2D to it, as we'll want it to be able to interact with these when the ball hits it. Let's rename it pink so we can see which one it is. Placing lots of blocks in your scene is going to be very messy. However, we don't need to do anything fancy like use the tile editor. Instead, we can just set a grid snapping on to help us. Make sure the coordinates are set to global, and then you can click on the little magnet symbol to enable snapping. It's blue when it's turned on. We can now use the drop-down to configure our snapping. The default for sprites in Unity is to have 100 pixels per unit, which you can see here on our block. This means that our blocks, which are 100 pixels wide, will be 1 unit, which seems fine. So we'll leave the X grid snapping at 1. However, our height is only 30 pixels, or 0.3 of a unit, so set the Y value on the grid snapping to 0.3. Now when we move our block around the scene, you can see it snaps into position. So let's position our first pink block at the top, at Y equals 3.9. That feels about right. Create a prefabs directory and drop this into there. We'll create a prefab for each colour. This both makes it easy to drag on and create your levels, and also means you can preset different properties of the blocks later when we add them. Let's create 8 different colours of blocks. Each time I'll duplicate the block with Ctrl D and just change the colour by going around the colour wheel until we have a full rainbow of colours. You can create as many or as few of these as you like. We'll drag each of the colours onto our scene and produce the rainbow of blocks below the pink one. Actually, I think I want the purple one at the top, so I'll just rejig these. Move all the blocks you just created in the hierarchy under our blocks prefab to keep this nice and tidy. Now if we select all of them, we can duplicate them with Ctrl D and move them to create the other columns. Keep doing this until you have 5 more on either side for a total of 11 columns. Then, just for a bit of variety, we'll add some indestructible blocks beneath them. I'll duplicate the yellow prefab with Ctrl D and rename this indestructible and set it to a light grey. Drag one on to the position you want it, and again duplicate it to create 2 more. Move these under our blocks holder too. This is starting to look good now. Let's create some walls to contain our game. Create a new empty game object in the hierarchy called walls. Again, make sure that the transform is reset so it's centered. Let's drag on our wall sprite from our sprites directory. Call this first one left wall. Let's set the scale to make it look a little bit more like a wall. Set X to 0.1 to make it thin, and Y to 8.3. That's about the right height. set the X position minus 5.6 to put it on the left. Just like the blocks, we'll use add component to add a box collider 2D to these so the ball can interact with them. We'll then duplicate this with Ctrl D and rename it right wall. Update the X position to positive 5.6 to put it on the right. Duplicate this again, call it top wall. For this, we'll set the scale to 11.3 in the X direction and 0.1 in Y, and the position to be X equals 0 so it's centered and Y equals 4.2. Finally, duplicate this to create the bottom wall, which is the same but at a position of Y equals minus 4.2. Now all that is left is to create the paddle and ball. We'll use the same block sprite to create our paddle, drag that in from the sprites directory onto our scene and rename it. Let's make it a bit thinner, so set the Y scale to 0.5, then position it at the bottom by setting the Y value to minus 4. Make this a light grey, a bit lighter than the indestructible blocks. This will need a box collider 2D on it too, so add that in like we have done for everything else. For the ball, drag in the ball sprite and rename that ball. We'll scale this down to about 0.15. You can use the lock icon to scale all of the axes at once. Position this just above your paddle at Y equals minus 3.8, and to this we'll add a circle collider 2D so it can interact with our world. We will also add a rigid body 2D because we will use the physics engine to simulate our bouncing ball. If we look at this in the game view to see how it looks, it's looking great, but that blue background doesn't really fit. Select the camera and change the background colour to black. That looks much better. That's it, we've nearly set up everything in the scene we'll need for the game. Sometimes I will dive straight into the code, other times I'll flesh out the game first. It's completely up to you how you work when making projects like this. That's it for this episode. I split this series up into smaller chunks to hopefully aid your learning. In the next episode, we'll start to add the code for the paddle and ball movement. This will bring the game to life. As ever, the full code is on GitHub and linked in the description below. See you next time.